Hello. So today we're going to talk about psychoanalysis, and this is a very interesting and important theory. I mean, there's a lot of people that criticize it, but still it's important to study it for the NCE exam, and maybe you're interested in knowing more about it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Let me share my screen so you can see the overview of what I'm going to say. And well, psychoanalysis is mainly known from what Freud said, Sigmund Freud, but there's of course other people that follow him and that are also important in psychoanalysis. Today we're going to focus on the classic part of psychoanalysis, the origin. That's why the overview will start with the origin, then we'll talk specifically about Sigmund Freud and basic concepts that he coined and that are like the basis of psychoanalysis. Then we'll go through the psychosexual stages and therapeutic techniques that are still being used, and of course some criticisms, since it's a theory that not everybody agrees with. Okay, so perhaps you've heard of Sigmund Freud and seen this picture before. It's an iconic picture. As you see, he's smoking. So he started thinking about this oral fixation that he had himself. And I'll tell you what is an oral fixation. But first of all, who's Freud? So Freud was a doctor. He studied first medicine, and he started doing studies on psychiatry. And he worked with women, especially with difficult cases that were at that time usually would just go and be locked up in an institution, mental health institution. And he thought maybe we should listen to their stories and understand what's going on, because there's many women that perhaps don't deserve to be locked up. And especially considering that he also, from his studies on these women that were locked up already, of course, he started working on institutions. He saw that there were two big kind of branches of mental disorders. One he called neurosis, and the other one psychosis. So the women with psychosis had something similar to schizophrenia. So they were difficult to treat, and there was not much they could do. They would stay locked down. But the ones that had neurosis, there were many different types of neurosis that he could work with. And especially these women deserved an opportunity and were able sometimes to go back to their normal lives. So this is very important from Freud. It's an important contribution because psychology at that time was just starting to be a discipline on its own before it didn't exist. So he coined the term psychoanalysis, the analysis of the psychic. And the psyche is the mind. And he realized that the psyche, or most of who we are, is unconscious. But there's three levels. There's the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. And the ego, that is what we normally see of a person, it's kind of conscious and half on preconscious. So the conscious part, we all see it, we are aware of it. It's something that is seen in our behavior. The preconscious is an area that is starting to be going towards the unconscious, but it's still accessible with some effort. And the unconscious, it's the part of us, of ourself, that we just can't access it normally. And it includes two more elements, not only the ego, but also the id and the superego. And of course, for Freud, these were very important topics and terms. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about them. In a very simplistic way, you could think about the id as the instincts and this kind of bad part of you, which is not really bad, but in the sense that it's going against morality and against the social rules and what would be expected by the society. So your instincts could take you to, I don't know, have a family, but go dancing all night and not care about your family or anyone else. It's a little bit selfish, this id, this focus on pleasures. So it's like, well, you like drinking, you just keep on drinking and no control over it. And of course, this is not well seen by the society. So there's this other part of you. So the structure of the self includes the id, the ego, and the superego. And this other part of you that is the superego is totally the opposite of the id. So if the morality part, the superego controls all the elements that are making you part of the society in a way that they help you to respect the rules, the regulations, the laws, etc. So, and follow authorities, etc. So when you let you focus too much on the id and your instincts, and you let them go, let them decide for you, then they might take over, and you might end up having trouble with the society because you're feeling too warm, you go naked on the streets. You're feeling like taking something from a store, you just take it without paying. And of course, that's not acceptable at all. So the superego will not let that happen usually, only if you have maybe a neurosis or some kind of mental issue where you let these instincts be shown too much, or the opposite. You're also too repressed by the morality, by the superego. So that instead of just being like normal, kind of in between, in the ego state is the reality, the one that takes you back to what a balanced life look like and what you would expect a person to be. You go too much into the superego side, and then you're too control and too perfect and too rigorous, and everything has to be following the rules. It doesn't matter if it's not needed, but you will follow the rules according to the superego. Of course, usually we are not in the extremes, we're usually in between. And the structure of the personality is one of the main concepts for Freud, and of course for his followers in psychoanalysis. And if we think about some of the techniques that were used by psychoanalytic therapists, the main one that Freud coined was free association. And free association was the idea that when you are relaxed in a session with your therapist and you're letting go all what comes to your mind and just talk about it, you might start thinking about how you feel today, and then associate, and then later go to say that it reminds you of the time that you were with your grandmother and how your father was very abusive and this and that. And then you start talking about all these elements that are kind of hidden, that are not normally something that you talk about with your friends or your husband or anyone else. And he would take notes and interpret all these free association, because it was a link to your unconscious. So it was usually a link to your past. That's why he later studied psychosexual stages, but I'll tell you about them in a little minute. And then, of course, sometimes when he would maybe confront you with this, he might find resistance. So recognition of resistance, or recognizing resistance, was also another therapeutic technique that he would use to help clients, or in this case, he would call them patients, be able to go beyond their resistance. And of course, all the time interpretation, whatever you do or not do can be interpreted. And some other term that he coined is transference and countertransference. And I'll talk a little bit more about it, but the transference analysis, where is it? No. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry, put it a little too late. So transference and countertransference is this idea that there is a relationship forming between the client and the counselor, and there are elements that you have to study. And in this case, the transference is a projection of irrational feelings or attitudes, usually of the past of the person, into the person, especially into the counselor in this case. So the client projects it to the counselor. It could also be the opposite, countertransference. So countertransference would be the unconscious attitudes of a therapist. And usually the therapist should be more aware of his unconscious attitudes to be able to avoid them. And of course, sometimes they're unconscious and they're automatic, so it's difficult to stop yourself from doing that. But once you're aware, you have to choose whether you stop seeing this client or you try to work on them before they have any influence or effect on your client. And that's something very important. Let me go back to this list. And then the transference analysis is the idea that, well, if there's a relationship between you and the client, and I mean, not a normal a work relationship, not any other type of relationship, but still in that interaction, their client transfers something about the feelings that he had for someone else, and you have to analyze that because that's very important. That's very important material. Technical neutrality means that you would just not want to take part or decide what is best or worst, but just be neutral about whatever the client told you. Of course, his neutrality is kind of to a certain level because still you have to interpret his or her dreams and use other therapies. And countertransference, so both transference and countertransference, especially in the case that there is any countertransference, you should study it too, not just send the patient to someone else. Here is not in the list, but another very important one is dream analysis. And dream analysis is the idea that when you are listening to your dreams, you might be getting like a door to the unconscious. So it's very, very interesting and important to do some dream analysis and in that way understand more about your unconscious. The free association technique, as I mentioned before, is like the main one because that's what you would do in a session. Dreams, maybe you forget about your dreams, maybe you make up some new dreams, but the free association is just happening anytime, all the time. And then another tool that he would use is catharsis. And the idea of catharsis is that you have this need to express what you have been repressing, what is kind of either denied or repressed in your unconscious. So once you talk about it, then you feel relief. So catharsis is also a therapeutic technique to start healing. And of course, you have to think about the main goals of psychoanalysis. So because the main goal is to release repressed emotions and experiences, and also to make the unconscious conscious, then this idea of catharsis is a very, very healthy way to do it. And it's already starting to feel like healing, like a healing process, a healing experience. And well, the transference and transference, we already talked about it. Then we go to something else that Freud mentioned as defense mechanism. So if you think about the women that he was looking at, he saw that sometimes they were very, very sensible to what was happening around them. So what they did was, defend themselves, protect their ego, their self in general, through defense mechanisms. And if you think about defense mechanisms, you think like, how do I defend myself? Okay, sometimes if someone is shouting at you and telling you, oh, you're terrible, you're the worst, or you're not good enough, or whatever, you might feel like shouting back or making something, doing something to them. However, you can't. So maybe you displace your energy. So instead of shouting to your boss back that he's shouting that you're not good enough, then you might come back home and shout to your children. They have seen a very strong association between violence at work and then violence at home. Because here you are the boss and over here you're the subordinate. Another one that is very common is repression. So when you're having some issue, maybe somebody abused you or did something terrible to you, or you went through a difficult time, and you don't want to talk about it, you might repress it, you might want to hide it and not talk about it. And sometimes it can be that you have this strong energy that you want to hit someone, but instead of going and hitting your child or shouting, you sublimate it. And sublimation is a very positive defense mechanism because you're using all that negative energy into either sports or arts on something where it's becoming positive, it's becoming accepted by the society. So you can use all that energy in a way. Sometimes you just go back to a previous stage in your development. For example, let's say this person that lost his job or something happened to him and instead of like trying to solve the problem, he just starts crying like a baby. So you could say, or according to Freud, he would be regressing, going back to a previous stage where usually it would be acceptable to cry. Okay. And then other defense mechanisms, there's a big list, but I'll just tell you three more. Are denial, projection, and reaction formation. And denial is kind of self-explanatory. It's easy to know what is denial. Projection, it's also this idea of projecting towards others what you should kind of talk to yourself or say to yourself. And reaction formation is when you're reacting in a totally opposite way as what you were expected in a specific moment. Okay. And something else that I have to tell you, it's about the psychosexual stages of Freud. Because of course, all these defense mechanisms could take you back in a regression to one of these stages. So what are the stages? Even though he didn't work with children directly, he worked understanding childhood in order to be able to help adults, especially women, and the women that had especially neurosis, because that was treatable compared to psychosis. So the first stage, from 0 to 2 years of age, a child is going through a stage called oral. And oral stage is because he has kind of an oral gratification need. It's all the time wanting to put everything in his mouth because it's pleasant, but also, of course, we know that it's also a way to learn about the world. Sucking, using his thumb in the mouth, or also, of course, for feeding, of course, just to learn about the world, and later babbling. Oh, excuse me. And the next stage after oral is anal. Anal stage is from 2 to 3 years of age. And in this stage, the child is learning a little more about their body. They're more aware of having an anus, that's why anal comes from anus, and responding to the social demands, for example, the ability to control your bladder and your bowel movements in a way that you don't need a diaper anymore, or the child doesn't need a diaper anymore. And of course, that means that he's going through this stage. For Erickson, it was the autonomy stage. He wants to be autonomous, wants to do everything on his own. And for Freud, it was the anal stage because the baby, or I mean, the toddler looks so much at his own body. He learned about the anus, for example. And then 3 to 7 is a phallic stage. And he thought of this name because phallic comes from phallus in Latin, penis, and it's related to awareness of being a female or a male based on your sexual physical traits. And in this stage, there's something interesting happening. There is a Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. So if you're a girl, according to Freud, you might be falling in love with your father. That's the Electra complex. And it is, if you're a boy, you might fall in love with your mom. And that's the Oedipus complex. And this is happening between 3 and 7. Later, around 7, children go through a latency stage. And this latency is when there is almost no sexual development, and especially no sexual urge. Girls want to play with girls, boys want to play with boys, and that's in this stage latency when the children are going through elementary school. And then we have the next stage of genital. And first, this is pre-adolescence until adulthood, all the way through life. And usually is when adolescents start becoming interested again in the opposite sex. And their body is maturing, and there's a need and interest in intimacy, etc. So that's something important to remember. And that's it for today. So I hope that you found it interesting and useful. And I'll see you another time in one of these little videos. And I wish you all the best if you are doing the NC soon.